Now.
So let me share my screen. Okay. Here we are. Thank you for joining us. And welcome to Macroeconomic Hours, Sunday, September 8th, 2024. And for today's topic, we're going to be talking about fiscal deficit and monetary policy and the interaction between the two. This is a major topic right now, especially because of the election. There are different visions of what might happen. Vlad is going to go into details of that. I'm going to focus on this article in The Economist and some discussions around it. The issues, government debts, how are government debts affecting the economy now and our expectations of in the future. There are issues about monetary policy making also that the Fed is talking about, and especially the issue of Trump versus Harris. How are they going to handle the deficits? Which one is going to grow the deficit faster or reduce the deficit faster? So, and Vlad is going to take care of that. He also is going to discuss the Penn-Wharton budget model, which is they take the plans of the candidates and feed them into the model that they have to see where the economy might be going in the coming years. Okay, I'm going to start with looking at the issue of whether macroeconomic policies have overcome the shocks that the economy has sustained in the recent past. And before doing all that, let me just apologize for my talking with some delays. Sometimes I have Parkinson, and that has affected my life enormously. I used to be a reasonably good presenter. So if you see problems, just forgive me. It's the dictation of the biology or life that has caused some trouble. I'll do my best anyway. So in the recent past, we've seen that inflation has gone down. GDP growth seems to be moderate, but solid, about 2% per year growth. Given what's happening in other developed countries, this is 2% growth in US consistently carried out in the last few years. Looks a very good performance. The labor market, it seems reasonably balanced in the sense that unemployment is not too high and not too low, and inflation is not contributing to inflation probably any longer. So this looks like a victory for monetary policy in particular, because the Fed was the one that raised interest rates and slowed down the economy and slowed down inflation. Federal government continued to run huge deficits and was not, although they were following the policy of Inflation Reduction Act, I don't think that really was contributing to slowdown of inflation that much. It might actually help later on because it builds infrastructure, but right in the past couple of years, no, I don't think the federal government did anything to reduce inflation. So, in fact, fiscal policy may have contributed to the slow decline of inflation rather than reducing it. So the question before economists is the Fed now should be considered a conqueror of inflation and the master of stabilization, or there are problems. Should the Fed take a victory lap? And my view is that not so fast. First, let's not forget that the high inflation that we experienced in the US and also other countries was partly due to the Fed acting with a delay, about a year probably. Of, they were slow to recognize the problem of inflation as something that could persist through time. When inflation started rising, they kept saying it's transitory, 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 and it turns out that it's really not that transitory. Then they had to raise interest rates sharply and very quickly in order to slow down inflation. So there have been certainly improvements in macroeconomic conditions, but there are still some difficulties ahead, particularly because the pandemic has had some ripple effects, and the policies adopted to deal with the pandemic have also had side effects that could destabilize the economy. And I'll explain what the problem is and what those ripple effects and side effects are. For the ripple effect, just think about commercial property markets. As a result of the pandemic, the demand for commercial property in city centers has declined, and that has had an impact on the economy of cities like San Francisco and New York, etc. And where that goes and how many bankruptcies we're going to see and how it's going to affect banks, affect finance, etc., that remains to be seen fully. So that's the ripple effect of the pandemic. And there are other examples as well similar to this. Now, the policies adopted to deal with the pandemic, they have had also side effects. The policies that the government and the Fed adopted in order to address the pandemic was huge expansions in fiscal policy, increased government expenditure, and money supply went through the roof. So that turns out that at the time it was helpful, but it may have changed the way people think about the future, about the effectiveness of these policies. And that's where the problem could lie. There could be changes in expectations, changes in the way people perceive policymaking, macroeconomic policymaking in particular, that could harm or basically change the way the economy operates in the future. So I'll get to the specific examples in a moment. In order to do this, first I want to clarify a couple of concepts. Safe debt regimes and risky debt regimes. It seems that in the world, essentially across countries, there are two types of general regimes that regarding risk, the way debt is viewed. The safe debt regimes are the following: situations where the government has credibility and it can borrow almost without constraint at the level of debt that it already has. It can increase the borrowing, and that does not increase the risk premium. For example, government of Japan in the past 30 odd years has continued to run deficits and borrow more and more, and the market has been willing to provide that funding and finance government's deficits because of the credibility of the government. That's true of the US, that's true of UK most of the time, not always, but when capital markets view the government as credible, they're willing to extend a lot of credit, large amounts, as for example, they did in the case of the pandemic a couple of years ago with the US government. When in safe debt regimes, when the government borrows to finance its expenditures, it does not affect money supply, because whatever money it earns by selling bonds, then it spends in the economy. So the money goes to the government and then comes back to the economy. So overall money supply doesn't change. And generally, or on average, we should not see a whole lot of inflation as a result of that. Of course, if there's a view that the government is not going to adjust its policies to reduce its deficits down the road, people may lose confidence, and that could cause problems for the government's borrowing. But as long as the government is in the safe debt regime, meaning that there's trust in the government that it can pay back its debt, there should not be any much impact on inflation over the years. If there's inflation, it's temporary, it goes away and averages out. Now, the risky debt regimes, which is most of the countries of the world are in that category, the government has not full credibility. Think about countries that have very little credibility. So borrowing more could actually increase their risk premium. So that's one characteristic of countries in risky debt regime. Moreover, the government may actually face a borrowing constraint. There is a certain amount that it can borrow. And if it wants to borrow any further than that, even raising the risk premium would not help. And the reason is rather simple. Suppose the government has some debt D and at interest rate I, and people in the market, investors, creditors, believe that the government will not be able to pay back the debt with that interest. Now, if you increase the interest rate by amount of risk premium rho and add it to I, if the government can't pay back the interest rate I, it definitely can't pay back the interest with the premium. So there's no reason to extend any further money to the government, even though it may be asking or for willing to pay much higher interest rates, because people just don't believe that they're going to see their money back. So in these kinds of economies, when the government needs to spend more, it may not be able to borrow, and it may not be able to spend. That could cause problem for the government. But usually in these situations, the government manages to press the central bank to help it out, print more money and pass it on to the government so the government can spend. But this is beginning of instability and high inflation. And in fact, if this kind of situation continues and the government continues to spend more than its revenues, we could easily get into a hyperinflationary situation. So that's the risky debt regime around the world. Now, in the US, which was considered a safe debt, to be in a safe debt regime, during the pandemic, there are signs that US may have switched to a risky debt regime. The government didn't do essentially something initially that would raise risks by itself. The pandemic had created enormous amount of uncertainty, and people were thinking that risks are very high. And in fact, one example of this is how much bonds in the past 4 years have lost their values. If you owned let's say $1,000 bond in 2020, early 2020, by now its real value would have gone down by about 26%. because of inflation. We have had about 20% inflation. And besides, when interest rates jumped up about 2 years, a year and a half ago, to bring down inflation, then the bond nominal value of bonds are the same, but if you want to sell them in the market, people are not willing to buy these old bonds with low interest because interest rates are now higher. So the price of the bond goes down. And that's why the bonds that people had bought in early 2020 or 2019 have lost enormous amount of their value. So that people in the bond market, in the financing, in the credit market, seeing that kind of loss due to uncertainties and shocks to the economy, they are very cautious, and they usually want to get a much higher risk premium as a result of that. And also, the creditors might actually see even a safe regime like in the US suddenly could be considered a risky one as a result of the uncertainties around the economy. So what is interesting, the evidence that a researcher at Stanford recently discovered was that he found out that during the pandemic, whenever the government announced that it's going to deal with some problem by throwing money at it, investors perceived that risks are rising and started selling their bonds. And those who sold their bonds actually were better off than those who did not later on. If rather than holding on to that bond that lost 26% of its value, they had sold it at the time and put the money somewhere else, they could have done a lot better. So this doesn't happen in normal times. If it were a safe situation where the government wants to borrow more, it should not cause the bondholders to sell their bonds. Actually, when the government offers its bonds to collect money and spend more, that people normally should be willing to pay, if it's in a safe regime, they should be willing to pay the government and get the bond, and interest rates should not change. And we should not see bondholders selling their bonds, rather they might be buying the bonds that the government offers. But in case of the pandemic, suddenly in the US, as soon as there was news that the government needs to spend more, those who were holding bonds started selling them. So let me so that was one side of how fiscal policy operated. Let me also discuss what happened to monetary policy at the time and how the two policies, monetary and fiscal, interacted. To do that, let me make a comparison between the pandemic and regular turbulences that happen in the economy. The function of monetary expansion during the pandemic was different from the way it's operated in other times. For example, in 1987, there was rumors that there's going to be problems in the stock market and the credit market, and suddenly the market was not stopped operating properly. People were not sure whether they should be buying or selling, and there was also a shortage of cash for all the transactions that people wanted to do. As a result, even though there was no apparent reason for the decline of the stock market, for the decline of the bond prices at the time. There was major trouble in the market, in the credit markets. In that case, as the stock and bond prices were falling, the central bank of the U.S., the Fed, came in and bought a lot of bonds, injected a lot of credit into the economy, and that solved what they call a plumbing problem, that there was not enough liquidity to make sure that there were no fire sales. So that's what happens in most cases of turbulence. Bond market experiences losses. For whatever reason, demand for cash goes up. And as a result of that, normal transactions may not be easy to do. So some people who need money quickly and immediately, they have to sell their bonds very early. And as a result, the bond prices go down. In that case, the Fed can buy bonds and save the economy because everything in principle is okay. The problem is cash flow problems that prevent the transactions from going through and forcing some people to sell their assets at much lower price. In that situation, if this normal turbulence, if you have no urgent need for cash and you have bonds, you don't go to the market. This is different from what we observed during the pandemic. Even people who did not need cash, they were selling their bonds because unlike the normal turbulence, in the case of the pandemic, people were perceiving the risks on the part of the government that something may happen, that the government may not be able to pay back its debt in the long run. So now, the government increases expenditure and during the pandemic, and the Fed also went into quantitative easing, printing or creating large amounts of money to buy bonds and keep bond prices high and asset prices high more generally. Now, the real value of bonds dropped because they had increased inflation, and also later on, when they increased the interest rates, the real value of the bonds went down. And this is a loss which the Fed was basically assuming the loss that bond holders were experiencing. The Fed was trying to buy the bonds and take over some of that debt to itself. In essence, that's a big loss for taxpayers. If investors, if this situation that we had during the pandemic continues and affects people's expectations, then investors may actually think that whenever there's a problem, the government may be recklessly running deficits and the Fed is going to come in and do QE in order to save the situation. And then we're in for a major instability in the economy because people would not be confident in the regime, in the government, in the Fed, and they would think that the government might actually expand expenditure for a long time and eventually create huge inflation because the Fed is willing to buy government bonds. So this has become a major concern, whether we're moving in that direction or not. And if we go in that direction, everyone will lose because those who want to lend might not see the benefit, might not see any benefits. the public may see that as taxpayers, for example, they lose, and those who need to borrow may not be able to borrow because interest rates are going to go sky high due to inflation. So to sum up, what has happened during the pandemic has created a situation where potentially people may start looking differently at the credibility of US government and US economic system. And hopefully that will not go in that direction to undermine the credibility of these institutions. But the problem needs to be addressed, especially by reducing the government deficit and making sure that the economy does not end up with pressures on the central bank to increase money supply. So far, monetary policy seems to be effective, but fiscal policy is testing the economy's limits. And if there are new major shocks, we might actually see the economy derailed, and that's the danger. Policymakers need to be super careful. Sorry for problems in my presentation.
You're fine, Hadi. You're perfectly fine. Folks, any questions so far? Feel free to unmute yourself and speak up or put a question in the chat. All right. Things are quiet. Should I talk more? Should I take over now and do my part, Hadi?
Yes. So
all right, very good. So let me share my screen. Give me 1 second and I'll start sharing the presentation now. Okay. And again, I have the chat on my other screen, so I'll glance at it ever so often. But if you have questions as we go along, feel free to speak up, folks. Okay, I'll start with the presidential candidates' campaign proposals, right? There was a great article in The Economist that talks about which of the two candidates might make the problem worse. And I'm also relying quite heavily on the Penn-Wharton budget model, which is one of my favorite sources. Fairly neutral, I think, in many ways. In most ways, fairly, very strong quality work done by them in this presentation. So if you want to take a look at those two resources, by all means do so. But let me begin by saying that assessing policy ideas by presidential candidates in this election seems to be a pretty difficult business, right? And so if you ask yourself why, then even in the best of times, projecting the impact of policy proposal is a very complicated business that involves a number of assumptions that you have to make, right? And the quality of analysis depends on the quality of the assumptions too. And it also depends on the idea that you're holding all other things static, generally speaking, right? Sort of that nothing else changes other than those policy proposals. But at the very same time, in this election, the proposals seem to lack detail and lack substance, generally speaking, and that's probably true on both sides. From time to time, we are seeing some, I think very generously, it could be described as maybe random proposals and unsubstantiated claims, like saying, oh, we're going to do cryptocurrency, and that will help us solve our problems, right? This is probably, highly questionable at best, but generally speaking, this election season seems to be quite heavy on those sorts of things. And then there is also differences between what candidates say in their official stances published through their official channels and things that they say while they campaign, while they meet with donors, while they speak up at the meetings that they have, right? And separating the differences between the two tends to be quite tough, right? And generally speaking, sort of a good candidate will, a candidate that will get elected, they'll often say yes to pretty much every single donor that they meet. And It's kind of interesting. I was listening recently to the History of the Germans podcast when I was driving to the iConverge session this weekend, and they talked about the election of the Holy Roman Emperor back in 12th, 13th century. And apparently, they engaged pretty much in the very same things. While they were campaigning, they would say yes to everyone and make all kinds of agreements. Once you were elected, then your stances would change quite a bit. So this is literally a problem as old as millennia, right? But back to our story. A few quick definitions that I want to run through before I get into the analysis of those proposals. Budget deficit is essentially the difference between government revenue and government spending. The analysis that the Penn-Wharton model concentrates on is essentially that of the primary budget deficit. And that's the same as the budget deficit, but it excludes the interest payments. And interest payments lately have been making up a larger and larger share of the government expenses, right? Because we are borrowing more and more, and the interest rates have been fairly high recently. Then there is also something you want to differentiate between your static or conventional analysis or static basis of analysis. So we're in this sort of analysis, we're only looking at the changes in revenues and spending associated with policy changes. But if you engage in the dynamic analysis or use the dynamic basis, you're basically saying, well, if you look at those policy proposals, this is what they think the impact on the economic activity, such as GDP growth or GDP contraction, might be. And you essentially incorporate that dynamic feedback into your calculation. And the result might be quite different, right? And finally, one important item to keep in mind is the idea of the distributional effect. Just because you're saying that a policy proposal may increase or decrease government revenues or government spending or government deficit, it doesn't mean that the distribution of this tax burdens and benefits is the same on all groups. Some groups inevitably will be hurt by those policies and some will benefit from them. And this is where a lot of jockeying around tax proposals comes from, right? There is that very famous saying by the senator from Louisiana from, gosh, what is it, 40, 50 years ago, is that the idea of tax proposals is, don't tax him, don't tax me, tax the fellow behind the tree. So distributional effects also matter. And so keeping all of those definitions and ideas in mind, let's talk a little bit more about the key policy proposals. And I'll start with the Harris campaign, and then I'll go on to the Trump campaign. So generally speaking, the proposals advanced by Vice President Harris involve, most of them are centered around individuals, right? And so those items are, number one is the expanding the child tax credit. The child tax credit currently is $2,000. It's scheduled to go down to $1,000 in the future in 2025, if I recall correctly. And so the proposal by Harris is to increase that credit to something like $3,000 to $3,600 per child. And there is also going to potentially be additional credit for the kids in the first year of their life, right? Sort of for the newborns, recognizing that new parents have a lot more expenses than they might have in the future. Another idea is the idea of expanding the earned income tax credit. And the earned income tax credit is essentially support for low income workers. And so currently, folks who are eligible are individuals between the ages of 25 to 64. What the Harris campaign wants to do is to expand this from workers who have children to childless workers as well. So that's one expansion. And another expansion is to essentially change the age limit to 19 years or older. So individuals between 19 and 25 and individuals above the age of 64 would benefit from this proposal as well. Another key component is essentially extending the higher health insurance premium tax benefits. So if you have low income, you will essentially continue receiving more generous health insurance subsidies, which are currently scheduled to expire. And finally, one of the new proposals is to provide down payment for folks who are buying their home for the first time. And that's an average of $25,000 of the policy of providing that $25,000 to first-time home buyers, basically during the first 4 years of the administration, right? At which time it would expire. And when we look at the impact on business, and so basically for individuals, everything in here essentially increases support to individuals. For businesses, we're talking about the raising of the corporate income tax rate. Recall that previously corporate income tax rate had been decreased to 21%. And so Vice President Harris is proposing to increase that to 28%. Okay. And so if you look at the, first, this table basically concentrates on the corporate income tax rate to businesses and the increase in benefits to select individuals, mostly low income individuals. And so if I can actually switch to a marker, let me try to do that. So if you look at the overall impact over the next 10 years, and so I'm concentrating on the last column right here, which sums up 2025 through 2034. The impact on the budget from the programs for individuals is going to be, and these are numbers, those are numbers in billions of dollars. So if you're looking at a decrease of roughly $2.3 trillion, which is quite considerable. The raising of the corporate income tax actually improves the deficits because it increases the government revenues. And this is roughly $1.1 trillion. And so this basically works out to the net effect on the primary deficit or surplus using the conventional analysis methods of a decrease of basically increase in primary deficits of roughly $1.2 trillion. If you take into impact the dynamic effects, and actually if you look at the Economist article, this was one of the primary criticisms of the original analysis. And so I think in response to that, this is what was added. The dynamic effect is actually quite a bit larger because those proposals are estimated to overall slow down economic activity, right? The idea here is that if you're increasing the corporate income taxes, if you're letting some of the provisions of the previous legislation expire, businesses will invest less money. Investment is going to go down from that perspective, and which means that economic growth is going to slow down in the future. So, so that's basically a negative $2 trillion that we're talking about. So that's not terribly good news, right? So if you continue this analysis and look at some of the newer proposals that have been advanced by the candidates, so which is increasing the long-term capital gains rate for individuals with very high incomes. And if I recall correctly, these are incomes of about $1 million. So if you make $1 million or more, then your long-term capital gains are going to be taxed at a higher rate. There is going to be an additional surtax for very high income earners, which raises that effective rate to roughly 33%, which is a pretty significant increase. Then we were talking about potentially, a positive effect here of $144 billion, right? So overall, compared to the previous calculations, that doesn't really make very much of a dent in the increased deficit, correct? And so, again, this summary is based on the official policy stances. These are not final in any way, shape, or form. There might be more jockeying around as the candidate potentially, moves a little more to the center before the general election. So they'll have to see how this particular cookie is going to crumble, right? So any questions about Harris proposals and their impact so far? All right, feel free to unmute yourself. Feel free to speak up, whatever works for you folks. You're a small group today. Okay, so then I'll just move on to the proposals by the Trump campaign. So for the Trump campaign, sort of in terms of the impact on individuals, it's primarily extending the provisions, the tax cuts that were enacted by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, or TCJA, right? So generally speaking, when this was passed, those provisions were set to expire in 2025. This is basically the mechanism used to control negative impact on government budgets and government deficits. And some of the provisions of TCJA, just to remind you, is the highest marginal personal income tax rate was reduced by roughly 2.5% from 39.6 to 37%. There were limits on the itemization of deductions that seem to actually punish the residents of high tax states that vote Democratic and benefit folks who live in lower personal income tax states that typically tend to vote Republican, etc. Right? One proposal that probably speaks to quite a few folks who are coming close to the retirement age is essentially excluding all Social Security benefits from taxation. And generally speaking, what we're looking at right now is somewhere between 15 and 50% tends to be excluded through the various income tax provisions. And now when they move on to businesses, again, extension of business tax cuts that were done by TCJA, which is accelerating depreciation, interest deductions, and things like that. And a lot of those original benefits by now have been reduced significantly. And this is what contributes to essentially higher investment potentially. And another important part of TCJA, as I mentioned before, is that the corporate income tax rate was reduced from 35% to 21%, a very significant decrease. And now the new proposal is to decrease it further to about 15% or so, right? So we're cutting that, sort of the proposals to cut it down by roughly a quarter, if you will. And so if you look at the impact of those in the analysis from Penn Wharton. So for individuals, and sort of again, I'm concentrating on the last column right here. For the individuals, the overall income on the tax deficits is pretty bad, right? Sort of we're looking at somewhere around 4.6 trillion, right? This is very significant. The provisions for business add another 1.2 trillion to the deficits, to the government budget deficits. And so the overall impact seems to be quite high compared to the Harris campaign at almost $6 trillion as opposed to $2.2 trillion, right? So which is quite high, right? However, if you take into account dynamic effects, such as a potential bump in economic activity and higher rates of economic growth, that impact actually goes down quite a bit. It's still much higher than the Harris proposals. We were talking about an increase in deficits of roughly almost 4.2 trillion, right? This is very, very significant. And so if you want to put all of those things in one table that analyzes this, and hopefully I've done more or less a clear job in here. So you can see the differences. So the Harris, spending actually, so the Harris increases spending by 2.3 trillion. Trump actually has no impact on spending, right? Because this primarily impacts the revenues in terms of the deficit. The Harris proposals include increased government revenues by 1.1 trillion, and the Trump proposals increase it by 5.8 trillion. So the static impact is an increase in primary deficit of 1.2 trillion for the Harris campaign and 5.8 trillion for the Trump campaign. Once you start accounting for the dynamic analysis and for the impact on the economic activity, because the Harris proposals are projected to slow down economic activity somewhat, we're looking at basically a larger impact of 2 trillion or so. For the Trump campaign, it's the impact shrinks a little bit, but it's still roughly twice as much at 4.1 trillion. If you consider the impacts on GDP, the Harris campaign, and again, so the analysis here concentrates on both a 10-year impact and on a 30-year impact. Again, it's extremely difficult to project that 30 years from now, right? So view those with a bit of a grain of salt. So you can see that the impact is larger from the Harris proposals. And this is a typo, by the way, gosh. If you look at the wages by 2034, not 2043, but 2034, you're looking potentially at a decrease in wages of almost 1% and as much as 3% in 2054. From the Trump campaign, sort of there is no changes of 2034 and maybe about 1.7 by 2054. And the differences here emerge for distributional effects for the main beneficiaries, because under the Harris campaign, the main beneficiaries are the low and middle income households, and the main losers are high income households and, of course, future generations, right? Because somebody has to pay in the future for all of those increases in deficits. And that part, by the way, is not quite different from for the Trump campaign. But for the Trump campaign, the main beneficiaries are actually most of the households, or nearly all of the households. Not necessarily equally so. The high income households are expected to benefit a lot more than lower and middle income households, and the folks who end up holding the bag are the future generations, right? So I'm seeing a question for the assumed range for lower, middle, and high income households. Sorry, I can't answer this question right away. I'd have to go back to the original document. Sorry about that, Devlin. Vivian, go ahead. Did you want to add something? I'm looking
Yeah,
at the. Go ahead.
thank you. I just feel like if they are increasing that kind of demand, and then the housing price is gonna jump because the supply is not there yet, then that will be raising the housing price again, and everybody's chasing the same thing. I understand that it sounds good, and it creates a lot of talking points for their campaign. It's just not gonna be very good policy. I've seen, I mean, it further supported by your comparison page here. It's just a lot of very short-sighted that kind of decisions. And one question I have regarding this is, if you look at GDP for, in 2054, regarding this, which candidate I'm gonna pick is all negative for the GDP growth, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So
Right.
I think for the Trump campaign, if you're looking at very short term,
Right.
so the next 4 or 5 years, there is a bump in GDP growth, but
Mhm.
sort of that GDP growth goes down, right? Sort of in the
Mhm.
future. So for the
Mhm.
Harris campaign, it's a decrease pretty much right away,
Right.
right?
Right.
Very small percentages, but for Trump campaign, it's an initial positive bump followed
Mhm.
by a negative
Mhm.
trend that more than makes up for it.
And if we just look at the next 4 years, because 4 years later we have to face the same question again, picking
Mhm.
a candidate, what kind of GDP impact that will be in 4 years? Because that will be the talking point for next candidate, right? For
That's
next.
that's that's right. That's right. So I think for the Democratic candidates, probably there is severe constraints on the potential GDP growth rates, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
For the Republican candidates, you can always point out to this temporary bump that happened right now. And
Right.
generally speaking, that improves your election chances. So from the
Exactly.
perspective of politics, that's probably a smarter approach that can maximize their re-election potential.
Exactly. So
Mhm.
4 years later, then people are gonna look at Republicans
Uh-huh.
in much
Yeah,
better.
but you're also making a very good point about the impact of those subsidies, the housing subsidy, first-time buyer
Mhm.
subsidies
Mhm.
on the market. So what we expect to see is that it will put pressure on housing prices, right? And
Mhm.
just because you're getting a $25,000 subsidy, I mean, the
Mhm.
true impact of that subsidy for the first-time buyers is going to be smaller than $25,000, right? It
Mhm.
might still be positive, but it will be smaller than 25 grand. But for everybody else, the impact clearly is presumed, is expected to be quite negative, right? So overall prices will go up. First time buyers will benefit a little bit, not by 25 grand, but by some amount under 25 grand. Non-first time buyers are essentially expected to lose by paying higher prices. Yeah.
Yeah. So I kind of disappointed at how they come up with policy. Sometimes I just wonder if like,
Yeah,
do they really think
that's
through this at all? Do they have any like people like you guys on their staff to really sort through all this? It's kind of scary.
well, that's a political economy, right? This is the intersection of politics and economics. And what makes for good economics might not make for good politics, and vice versa, right? And it's, sort of the question is how long, sort of financing of government deficits for debt will continue is an important one, right? In one of the previous sessions, we've talked about the economist projections that at most we have 20 years before this trend must reverse, before this trend becomes actually fairly irreversible and will generate very tough adjustments in the future. And will we go the route of the Germans by sort of creating a constitutional break, right? Which requires sort of the primary deficits essentially to be zero. That's not quite clear to me that this will happen anytime soon. It's easier to spend in the short run than to think about the long-term consequences. And unfortunately, our fiscal discipline doesn't seem to be nearly anywhere close to that of Germany, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, I have one last question regarding Professor Hardy's presentation. There was a slide regarding the deficit, things like that. I couldn't really understand. I don't know which slide that is again.
Let me share my screen and then go over the screens quickly. You tell me which one is
right. And Professor Hardy, we had the bet on the next interest rate cut. Mine is 25 and yours 50. I don't know who's gonna win this time, but I think it's gonna be 25.
Yes.
Basic.
Let me.
I just want to say that the last time I looked at those projections by the markets, they were weighing them roughly equally at 50-50 chance of either. So there is still some suspense going on between the two bets, right?
Okay, here are the slides.
I think the very last slide.
Is this or the one before this? This one?
Yeah, this one.
Right. Okay, here I'm trying to explain here that monetary policy, quantitative easing has been very helpful in getting us out of the pandemic or the effects of pandemic. But if people think that the Fed does this to help the government run a huge deficit recklessly, that could actually cause a lot of problems.
Okay.
So, because the entire effect of policies depends enormously on how people view those policies. Do they think that these are sustainable, credible, or not?
Right.
And was the difference between the normal turbulence and the pandemic situation. In the pandemic situation, people thought that the US government might be in a bad situation pretty soon, and therefore they were treating it as a risky regime rather than a safe regime. In normal turbulence situations that on and off occur, if a bank goes under, if a major part of the market gets hit by some shock, credibility of the government is not questioned. Therefore, the government can actually increase expenditure. The Fed can come in and buy bonds, and bonds behave the way that we normally expect them, in the sense that, for example, if there's a problem with the liquidity, then the Fed comes and buys bonds and injects some money into the economy, and everything goes to equilibrium, a reasonable place very, very soon. But if people lose that view and they think that the Fed is essentially printing money in order to finance
Got it.
government deficit,
Got
then
it.
you're going to get into a risky debt regime. And the good example of the risky debt regime is Argentina. You don't want to go there.
I see. Okay, got it. And
It's just one point I would like to add here. It's really amazing how the same policy that looks reasonable in a situation and you would want to carry it out in another situation looks terrible. And for example, during the pandemic, the government increased expenditure, monetary policy expanded. For a lot of developing countries, doing exactly the same thing could have very negative effects. Think about a country that has a huge debt and can't pay back its debt. In that situation, if they start spending more to deal with the pandemic, actually risks are going to go up and people are going to find it even harder to, the policymakers are going to find it even harder to correct the situation, because by increasing money supply, they only are going to see worse inflation. People, risks continue to go up as a result of the difficulties raised by the policy. So it's actually going to be counterproductive. And that's why it's very important for countries to try to reduce their risks and make sure that they're credible. And the markets do not view them as not uncreditworthy.
So, Hadi, would it be correct to say that essentially, sort of those, sort of the decreases in credibility and those increased risks, they essentially extremely limit your fiscal space, right? That's available to you as a government, right? And fiscal space is deeply problematic because you never know when it ends. But those sudden changes in credibility and risks, they can create a crisis extremely quickly.
Right. That's correct. Exactly.
So,
many developing countries have put themselves in situations where if the shock comes to their economy, they don't know what to do and they want to borrow, but nobody's willing to lend to them. So we see all these major crises around the world.
can you imagine if Donald Trump is gonna tell what Fed they should do, then the credibility of our Fed is gonna go into the toilet. So anyway,
exactly. That's a very good point. That a lot of people who think that the Fed should not be there and it should be dismissed and replaced by maybe some people who just follow the directions from politicians. That's just wrong and wrong-headed.
I mean, in some sense, we can argue between the idea of having, some sort of an automated mechanism, right? Using some sort of a rules-based automaton to make those decisions. And I think, most economists agree that perhaps this is not the way to go, but even that would be preferable to essentially politicians directing Fed in its entirety, right?
Exactly. Trump wants politicians to dictate what interest rates should be, and that's really wrong.
Gitika, do you have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to previous sentiment, I 100% agree that Fed and politician or politics, those should be two different things. And I don't think as of now politicians could dictate what Fed does. And hopefully it remains the same. Like, at least this is what I believe, like nobody can influence what Fed does. They should just be entirely data driven. The question I have is, I've been talking to a lot of people recently, and I still feel like people are feeling the pain of inflation moderately it feels like on a high level it's stable. The CPI has been growing to 2.6 or 2.9% recently. However, all the normal to middle class people, they are still feeling like food prices are still a lot higher than it used to be. The everything else, like so my question to you is like, given the Fed has decided to relax the policies a little bit, do you all think like there would be further the similar side effect would be created the way we have seen during the pandemic, or it's generally going to be better to lower the interest rate right now? I know we all are speculating, so just
Right.
a
Let me
question. Yeah.
give my answer here. That's a good question. My own feeling is that the Fed should basically make it super clear that it will be fighting inflation first and foremost. But if the trend in inflation is such that it seems to be going down and hitting 2%, very minor opening, reducing interest rates by 1/4 percentage point this month might not do much harm. But if they cut it by 0.5 percentage point or more, you're going to see chaos for two reasons. One is that some people might think that the Fed got scared and reduced interest rates under political pressure, because there's a lot of political pressure, especially coming from the Republican side, to lower interest rates. That's one problem. The other is that if they cut interest rates but more than 1/4 percentage point, I think a lot of investors are going to conclude that there's some problem that the Fed is foreseeing ahead in the times ahead, and therefore it's going to scare the markets tremendously. A lot of investors are going to start reading into it, that what is it that is so bad that they need to cut interest rates that much, and I think that's going to be just a bad signal, either bad policy making or incompetent policy making, or making policy under political pressure.
Yeah. Yeah, plus one to that. I've been having the same sentiment. Like, if they reduce more than a 0.5 percentage point, then it might give a wrong signal in the market, and it might create a ripple effect. Like, hey, like what the heck is going on with the economy?
Exactly.
However, it's like so what I see is like if Fed reduces the interest rate by 1/4 percentage point, then you all feel like, yeah, it's probably okay doing that, but more than 50 BPS, that's a little bit higher.
Right.
That's what you are saying, right? Okay.
I think 1/4% would be reasonable, and the expectation has built up, and the Fed also has made, the chairman of the Fed has made statements that have essentially confirmed those expectations to lower interest rates at least by 1/4 percentage point in this month.
So at this point, Fed is sort of being held hostage by the market expectations. So if it doesn't bring it down by a 1/4 of a percentage point, that will create problems as well, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Oh, folks, we're a little over time. So Hadi, I had, sort of a couple of slides talking about the, central banker disagreements. Should I cover that quickly, or should we save that for a different session?
Let's keep it for another session.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank
All
you
right,
so
folks.
much.
Hey, thanks again. Thank you. So very helpful. Always.
Thank you.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I joined late. I
all.
joined late, Vlad. Would you be uploading this session on the YouTube?
Yeah, I'll upload it to the YouTube. So if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, you'll see it pop up automatically on your.
All right. Thank you. Thank
Okay.
you so much.
All right. Very good.
Bye bye.
All right. Thanks all. Talk to you soon. Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.